Hello, students. We are again here with a new text that is Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. This is the session for last minute revision when we are going to have the proper minute analysis of the text to ensure ourselves for the smooth preparation for the board exam. When we talk about the last minute revision, we have to understand everything in a very detailed manner pertaining to the text, structure, imagery, the poetic devices, and all kinds of things that may be asked in the examination. Let's begin the poem Fire and Ice. This poem has two stanzas. This poem has 9 lines. Within this, within these 9 lines, the poet talks to us. Rather, the poet discusses in the poem that fire and ice both are quite enough to destruct the world. Here in the poem, fire is a symbol of emotion. Fire is a symbol of emotion of desire, and ice is used for the emotion of hatred. Here in the poem, the poet is quite contemplative with the thought that fire that symbolizes desire is quite enough to destruct the world. But if the world has to perish twice, ice is quite sufficient for the destruction of the world. We have to have this particular general idea about the poem to have the proper analysis of this poem. Now let's begin the analysis of the text. First of all, break the poem apart. How many stanzas we do have? When we read the poem, we come to know that we have only two stanzas. How many lines and what is the rhyme scheme? Let's analyze the text. We have two stanzas in the poem. There are 9 lines in the poem. What is the rhyme scheme? A, B, A, B, C, B, C, B. List the words that rhyme if they do. When we find the rhyming scheme, then we also get to know about the rhyming words in the poem. For example, fire, desire, ice, suffice, hate, great. The next question, that is, how is the idea developed? So we have the two contrasting words, that is fire and ice. So the two contrasting words take us to the contrasting ideas presented in the poem. It means fire is the symbol of desire and ice is the symbol of hatred and insensitivity. Both are quite enough to destruct the world. Now, what is the theme of the poem? When we talk about the theme of fire and ice, we have to understand that this poem is a metaphor for human perceptions of desires and hatred. What does the poem remind you of? This poem reminds us that human desires are limitless and unbridled. As we have already discussed, that fire is the symbol of desire and ice is a symbol of hatred. They give rise to conflicts and stop us from being kind to others. The next question, what do you wonder about the poem? According to my interpretation, I feel or I think that the poem revolves around the age-old question whether the world will end in fire or in ice. And the poet has also discussed the same thing in the poem. The poet discusses about this age-old question whether the world will end in fire or in ice. Now, the next question is, who is telling you the poem? Obviously, the poet Robert Frost, who firstly stands in support of fire, and in the next stanza of the poem, he also suggests that ice is sufficient for the destruction of the world. What is the underlying message in the poem? The same, whatever the theme of the poem, that does it have, that the poem is a metaphor for human perceptions of desires and hatred. Let's talk about the mood or the tone of the poem. The tone of the speaker is quite contrasting with the seriousness of the subject matter. Here, the tone of the poet is quite casual and conversational. The mood is contemplative. Now, what words or phrases give the images or theme emphasis? Obviously, we have the two words in the poem that give the images or theme emphasis, that is desire and hate. Now, what is the poet discussing in this short poem? The poet is discussing about the two different views that would be the end of the world, that would be the cause of the end of the world. Both fire and ice are powerful forces to destruct the world. Firstly, the world will end in fire, as we know that fire is the symbol of desire in this poem, and ice can also be a great cause for the end of the world. Now, what is the main or central idea of the poem? The world would end in either of the two ways, that is, fire or ice. Now, how did the poem make you feel? The poem projects a pessimistic outlook on the theme of the end of the world. It is only because of the unattainable dreams of humankind will in all cases lead to catastrophic destruction on the earth. Is there any interesting vocabulary in the poem? Obviously, we have the two words perish and suffice. Now, why do you think the poet has included images in the poem? The poet has included images in the poem to show how destructive fire and ice can be. Why do you think the poet has written this poem? To discuss the age-old question whether it would be preferable to freeze to death or burn to death. Now, we have also the poetic devices in the poem, and here we have the list examples of figurative language. The first poetic device that we find in the poem is alliteration. Favor fire, some say. Then the next poetic device which you have is anaphora. Some say is repeated at the beginning of lines 1 and 2. The third one is paradox. When the poet says in the second stanza, but if it had to perish twice, it means it is a paradox because nothing can die twice. The next is symbol. Symbol plays a very important role in this poem because fire is the symbol of desire and ice is the symbol of hatred and insensitivity. We have the next poetic device that is assonance. I hold with those who favor fire. And the next one is enjambment. It means there is the continuation of line. There is no any punctuation mark at the end of the line. It means the lines are in continuation with other lines. This is what the poetic device enjamb. Now, what would happen? What happened in the poem? Obviously, within the 9 lines of the poem, we come to know when the poem starts, we get to know that some people believe that the world will end in fire, while some people stand in support of the fact that the world will end in ice. So here, fire represents one's passions and desires, and we know that human desires are quite limitless, unbridled, uncontrollable. So in contrast to fire, some believe that ice can also be a great cause for the end of the world. Ice here represents hatred and insensitivity. We have also a poetic device named personification in the poem, and that is fire and ice, because both are quite capable of destruction. Now, the important question on which we have to consider, that is, what lesson did you learn from the poem? Not only ice but also fire is really destructive, and only love can save the world. What part of the poem gave you a strong visualization? Fire and ice are symbols, not of natural disasters, but of humanity's ability to create disasters of its own. What do we hear in the poem? Destruction of the world. And what do we feel in the poem? The poem is a powerful warning put across by the poet. We have to keep all these things in our mind before we appear in the board examination. Now, according to my interpretation, whatever I have felt, I have expressed before you. Now, read the poem once, twice, and then there should be your interpretation. Hopefully, you will come with some new sort of answers. You will come with some new interpretation, and that will also be quite helpful in your preparation for the board examination. Now, we have some questions that have already been asked in the CBSE board examination in the earlier years. The first question, fire and ice projects a pessimistic outlook. When you go back into the analysis template, you will come to know that this question has already been discussed, that obviously fire and ice projects a pessimistic outlook. It also projects a pessimistic outlook on the theme of the end of the world. The unattainable dreams of humankind will in all cases lead to catastrophic destruction on the earth. The next question is, explain why the poet personally holds the conviction that the world will primarily end in fire. It means it is only because of the unbridled human desires the earth will end in fire. Human desires are completely unbridled, uncontrollable, limitless, and this will become the first reason of the end of the death with fire. Write down the two different views about the end of the world. First of all, we have to understand if we have the two different views here in the poem, so all the two different views are quite contrasting. We have the two different views about the end of the world here in the poem, because some people believe that the world will end with fire. In contrast to fire, some people believe that ice can also be a great cause for the end of the world, because fire in this poem represents one's passions and desires, and ice here represents hatred and insensitivity. To say that for destruction, ice is also great for the poet, what does ice stand for? Obviously, ice stands for hatred and insensitivity. How is it sufficient to bring destruction? So already it has been discussed in the analysis template. Which age-old question does the poem revolve around? Now, this is what the most important question, that the poem revolves around the age-old question of whether the world will end in fire or in ice. It would be preferable to freeze to death or burn to death. This is what the matter of discussion here in the poem. Now, which age-old question does the poem revolve around? Basically, we have to understand that in the poem, the poet discusses about this particular age-old question, where the poet wants to determine the answer of this question with the help of the discussion whether the world will end in fire or in ice. Now, Fire and Ice was first published in 1920. Briefly explain how the First World War might have influenced the theme of the poem. The poem is written shortly after the end of the First World War, and that is exactly what the theme of the poem Fire and Ice is, wherein the poet elaborates on the causes that could have led to the end of the world. He says either greed or hatred can destroy the world. Discuss how extreme behavior can hasten the end of the world with respect to fire and ice. This is also a very important question where we come to know about the two different views regarding the end of the world and associates the extreme behaviors to it. Extreme behaviors pertaining to fire and ice, because they both are quite sufficient to destruct the world. Imagine that Nelson Mandela read Fire and Ice as Mandela write a diary entry associating the impact of the troubled history of South Africa with the idea expressed in the poem. You may begin like this. So this is what the kind of diary entry in which you have to express your ideas or feelings pertaining to the poem that you have already read out. So as on the basis of the poetry analysis template for this particular poem Fire and Ice, it is quite important for every one of you to go through it and try to have the proper idea of the poem with the general idea of the text. What does it mean? What is the structure? What is the poetic device? What are the poetic devices used in the poem? And what are the other relevant things that are quite necessary to keep it in your mind in order to have, in order to be ready for the examination. So that's all. Thank you. We will again try our level best to come with a new video on the chapter A Letter to God very shortly. Thank you.